Welcome back, everybody, to The Human Perspective. Today, we're going to have another great interview with Spencer West. Many of you may be his follower already on Tik Tok, where you have how many followers?
Over 4 million.
Over 4 million. Amazing. But let's please start by giving our descriptions. So I am still a 74-year-old disabled woman. I have brown hair with highlights. I am wearing a colorful blouse with green and blue and a floral design with red flowers. And we are in the foyer with all these pictures and other things around. And Spencer, could you please introduce yourself?
For sure. So my name is Spencer West. I'm a 41-year-old gay cisgender male. I'm white. I am a double amputee. Obviously, I'm also disabled. I have got a bald head, a cleanly shaven face. I'm wearing a black t-shirt that has a Reading Rainbow logo on the front. And then I'm also wearing some gold and tortoise frames.
Okay, so let's dive in. You've got a very interesting background. So where did you grow up and where are you living now?
Yeah, so I grew up in the state of Wyoming. That's where my family still lives. And I currently live in Toronto, Canada. I moved here about 14 years ago for work and then never left.
And what do you see as some of the major distinctions between Wyoming and Toronto?
Well, quite a difference in population, number one. When I was living in Wyoming, the animal population outnumbered the people population. So living in Toronto, I think we're just about 3 million people here. Accessibility is a bit better here, although there's still a lot of work to be done. And there's more opportunity for me in particular. Growing up in Wyoming, although it was lovely, you were limited as far as what you could do in regards to a job or career.
Anybody, disabled or not?
Correct.
When did you acquire your disability?
I was born with my disability. And they didn't realize until I was physically born. And then they saw that something was wrong with my legs. They looked different. They didn't look normal, so to speak. And after a bunch of tests, they discovered I had a genetic disease called sacral agenesis, which basically affected the sacrum. It's like in between your tailbone and your spine. And it has varying degrees of what can happen. For me, it affected the muscles in my legs. And then it also affected my bladder a little bit. But other than that, so it resulted in 2 amputations.
Do people ever ask you about whether you made the right decision or your family made the right decision on amputating your legs?
Yeah, not as often as I think people would assume, but I have gotten that question before. But for me in particular, one of the things that I think both my family and I have always been really good at is knowing what I need and what I want. And so my mom was really good at asking a lot of questions and understanding what's the right thing. And so for me, amputating both my legs, prosthetics were just too hard to use. We tried and it didn't work. So for me, it was easier to navigate the world on my hands and then in a wheelchair. So for us, it was definitely the right decision.
And you have great broad shoulders.
I do, which makes it hard to find clothes, to be honest.
Yesterday, my husband and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. And one of the first things that made me attracted to him was seeing him in his wheelchair from the back, and he's got really broad shoulders. So I think broad shoulders definitely are something that are attractive. So you're in a really unique position because you can talk about both having grown up in the United States and being in Canada. So I'd like to focus a few minutes on representation of disabled people in the media in the US and Canada, and ask whether or not you see a distinction. Do you see both countries as being pretty equal? Do you see CBC, for example, and other Canadian stations doing more in the area of disability than the United States? What's your view?
I mean, from my perspective, I don't think anyone's doing a great job, to be honest. What's interesting about the United States is they have such a broader reach when it comes in a broader audience. That's sort of where movies and a lot of, popular TV shows happen and are made. Canada is still small. I think, for the first time in a long time, Schitt's Creek was one of the big shows to come out of Canada. But we rarely, in any country that I've been to, see representation like myself or even like you, Judy, at least from my perspective, being seen. So no, I don't think anyone's doing a great job, to be honest. And I would even say, the charters of rights and freedoms that Canada has is very limited, even when it comes to disabled rights. We have the broader global sort of disabled rights, but even here in Canada, like the province of Ontario, where I live, we have something similar to the ADA, but that's not a federal law all across Canada, to my knowledge. So, I mean, there's still quite a bit of work to do here when it comes to that. So even I feel like representation is last on the list at this point.
I think it's a very important point that people in Canada and the US may not be aware of, but laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act are federal laws, and we basically look at them as floors, as you were saying. So every state has to at least reach the floor, and then states can exceed it. But in Canada, that's not true in many cases. So a province, as you were saying, can have a law which can be good, but then another province may have one which is not as strong. This discussion for me is really interesting because, quite frankly, the US doesn't know that much about Canada. Canada doesn't know that much, I think, about the US. And so I'm also partially hoping that this discussion will enable more of that to happen. What got you started in creating videos?
Yeah, growing up as a kid, I loved to do it just on my own when we'd go on vacation and just play around. But it wasn't until I moved to Canada and I became a motivational speaker and I was sharing a bit of my story. And the one thing that the feedback that I was getting in the very beginning, this is before Instagram even existed, was this was nice to hang out with you for an hour, but like, where do we find more of you? And so we thought, well, where can we continue the message that I'm sharing in a way that is not just a 1 hour keynote, but can be potentially daily. And so that's when we started to look at social media as an option. And just so happens that's sort of when things were starting to expand and Instagram came along. And then, in the last few years, TikTok as well. So it sort of came from that. It's like, how do we continue to connect with people that we've met or find new people?
So what drew you into wanting to be a public speaker?
It's, what, I initially, that was never on my radar. A friend of mine kept saying, like, you should be a speaker. And I'm like, but talk about what? Yeah, I have a disability, but like, I'm not here to use that to like inspire people in that regard. And I was like, so I don't really have anything to talk about. That seems a bit narcissistic and arrogant to do so. And then I did some traveling and I volunteered in East Africa. And I had volunteered with this amazing organization. It unfortunately no longer exists, but I was so enamored by what I had learned. And I thought, maybe this is my way in. Maybe I could be a speaker and tell my story on behalf of another organization to do some good at the same time. And that's sort of when I started to lean into it and things started to take off from there.
I find you very engaging. I love looking at your pieces because you're very present. You're really there. When did you start identifying as a disabled person?
Oh gosh, I would probably say in the last like 8 to 10 years. I grew up in a time, I was born in 1981. And for me, and specifically in Wyoming, we were sort of taught, you don't want to see yourself as disabled. You want to overcome your disability. You want to look just like everyone else or be as normal as possible. And now we know how detrimental that is and how ableist that thinking is. It's like, I don't have anything to overcome but ableism at the end of the day. And so it's taken me a long time to unlearn a lot of those things and to be comfortable. One day I just started saying it in my speeches in hopes that I would be comfortable and believe it. And eventually I did. And a lot of what you see on social media now is me learning in real time. How to really lean into my disability, how to be proud of it, and how to be a part of the community in a way that is helpful.
So what role do you believe you're playing within the disability movement to advance it?
What I hope is through the videos that I make, I give both disabled and non-disabled folks an example of what it's like. So specifically for non-disabled folks, so the barriers that I face, some of the privileges that come along with my disability. So then the next time that they're out in their own community and they go to a business, they might think for the first time, oh my gosh, there's 3 stairs to get up in here. How would Spencer get up in here? How would another disabled person navigate this space? I'm a firm believer then if and being someone that's queer, this is like a big thing in the queer community too. If you know someone, maybe not directly, but if you have the experience and know someone, you have a bit more empathy and your lens starts to change about the world around you. And the hope is then you start to realize that you can play a part in taking action. So giving folks an example and also being a sort of a face of representation of being queer and disabled and that, we exist.
What are some of the comments that you get? Like 4 million viewers. That's like amazing. And it's like amazing. Do people write to you, let you know the impact that you've been having on them? I know I hear some from people, and then I feel like frequently it's the first time many people have even touched on the discussion of disability. So our impact is limited initially. Do you feel like you're getting many people who are coming back and learning more? And do you have any way of knowing what changes, what maybe more long-term changes they're making?
Yeah, it's hard to like really know like if changes are being made and what they are, but I think what I experience and what I see is people do come back and they do want to learn more and they want to understand more. And one of the things that I've been getting a lot lately, which is really lovely, is a lot of non-disabled folks talking about I've shared these videos with my kids and teaching my kids about folks with disabilities and not to be afraid and to understand that you can ask questions, but how to ask questions in a way that is comfortable for everyone. And so I think for me, when we're looking at non-disabled folks, those are the things that I notice, and that you have repeat folks that come back and always comment on your content. But I do, similar to what you're saying, I do get a lot of direct messages as well, of like, thank you. I had no idea. Like, I did a video the other day about how having an automatic car wash reduces a barrier for me because washing my car can be so challenging, and I end up being soaked if I try to do it just by myself. And there were a lot of folks who were like, oh, I never thought of something as simple as an automatic car wash could reduce a barrier. And that's a bit superficial, but I think it's a good example.
I don't think it's superficial at all. And yeah, that's a great example. And I think what's good about that example is if people care to get their car washed, the reason I was smiling when you were discussing it is thinking about our van and how it's pretty dirty, whether or not we have access to an automatic car wash. But for those people who want to keep their car clean, that's a great example. And you can just multiply it in so many different ways.
Yeah.
Are you working with other disabled people in media?
When it comes to actual work, I haven't actually done any physical work with folks yet. I would really like to. I've got a friend named Andrew Gurza who is based here in Toronto, who's incredible, and I've been on his podcast and we become friends and those sorts of things. But my platform sort of took off, Judy, during the pandemic. So being together wasn't an option. I really hope to have the opportunity. I will say this: I was part of a series that was released on YouTube called Everybody Curious.
I know we're going to talk about that. Go ahead.
Okay, so where we worked with kids with disabilities, learning about the birds and the bees and sexual orientation and dating and safe sex and all of those things. So I'm slowly starting to get into that space, and there's lots of folks that I would love to work with at some point for sure.
So maybe we could stay on this subject for a minute. How did this program come about? Why did they reach out to you? Did you have anything to do with its development, or did they reach out to you when they had started to develop it?
Yeah, so this is the 3rd season of this show. And the first 2 seasons were in person in a classroom with 2 other hosts. And so they had reached out because they're based in Toronto and knew who I was and said, would you be willing to read a question that one of the students asked for one of the videos? And I said, sure. And then during the pandemic, I met the producer and she was talking about, season 3 and sort of what they were thinking. And I just in passing mentioned, like, I think it would be really great if, we had this conversation with kids with disabilities, because we're usually left out of most conversations, and specifically when it comes to, puberty and the birds and the bees and all of those sorts of things, and our bodies sometimes change differently than non-disabled folks. And so I wouldn't say that I was the driving force there, but it was a discussion that we had. And then when it came time to film, she reached out and was like, well, do you want to co-host and be part of the show? Which I was really grateful for.
Yeah, and people should really watch it. I was watching a little bit of it earlier, and it's great. I mean, what I really like about the program is you and your co-host, and the discussion that you're having with children. And as I've been saying, you've got this very natural comfort level where you can speak to people of all ages. And here you are talking to children who have disabilities about subjects that adults frequently have difficulty discussing with any kids. And so I really think it's a great example of A, the importance of these discussions, and B, how people can have fun by doing this. It's a great example.
Thank you.
So many of your videos explore your identity as a disabled man. What are some of the key messages that you're trying to elevate?
Ultimately, it's to help people understand, that as a disabled community, the barriers that exist are barriers that we choose to exist. Like, if we all stopped choosing to allow them to exist, the world would be just so much more inclusive. And I love this idea of, like, all of our liberation is tied up together, from, the Black community, people of color, the queer community. And if we all started to work together and stop choosing to allow these things to exist, I would hope the world would look a lot different. And so for me, that's sort of what I'm doing is in a funny, lighthearted way. I want people to understand what my experience is and what that looks like on a daily basis, in hopes that it provides a bit of empathy and a new lens, so that then they're interested in looking, well, maybe we don't have to choose this anymore. Maybe we can choose something different so that everyone can participate. Because for me, I'm really grateful that 4 million people are interested in what I have to say, but I want to make sure that we're doing something with it, and not just, the TikTok is fun and I'll do the dances every now and then, but for me, it's like, how do I use this platform in a way to help our community access the world more?
I mean, I think we've been discussing this, for example, when you talked about the automatic car wash. I believe that one of the issues, not just in disability, but across underrepresented populations, is very much that we don't know the issues that people are facing.
Yeah.
I certainly think that's true in the area of disability. And, as you've been discussing, disability is pretty complex. It's not a group. It's like people with all kinds of disabilities whose onset of disability occurs all across the lifespan, and who come from every other, community in our countries. And so the ability to bring people in, to allow them to understand, I think, not only the barriers that we're facing and how to address some of those, like steps and a ramp, captioning interpreters, automatic car washes, electric doors, wider bathrooms, whatever the issue may be, not wearing perfume, scented products. In many cases, people really don't know that these are issues. And hearing it one time also may have an impact, but may quickly be forgotten, not intentionally.
Yeah.
Second, third time, we get rid of the term non-intentionally. But looking for a moment on the issue of being a gay disabled man, do you feel that the queer community has included those with disabilities? And I'm only selecting this because of the way you identify, and I'm not saying that it's different than any other community. What barriers do you feel still exist what changes do you feel are slowly happening?
So there's two things from my experiences as being a gay man that's also disabled. Number one, it's just accessing the spaces in general. Accessing queer spaces it's very difficult, specifically here in Toronto. We've got one street called Church Street, which is the village here, which is known as sort of where the queer community has always existed. And most things have stairs. And it's really interesting here in Toronto, most buildings, their bathrooms are in the basement, which is like so frustrating. So just being able to access the space and be a part of the community doesn't exist, and is very limited. And then if we look at it from the other lens of looking at trying to date, specifically a lot of gay men can be a bit superficial, and it's all about how you look and what your body looks like. And so being disabled and having a body that looks a little bit different isn't seen as desirable, isn't seen as sort of partner material. Now there's all sides of it. There are folks that can be really terrible, and there can be folks that don't care. And it is really amazing. And I have had, relationships and those sorts of things. But I think it's those two things. It's the stigma of looking a certain way in order to be desirable, and then actually physically accessing spaces to be a part of the community. So I would say on the whole, we are left out. Now, the interesting thing is there's a lot of shows now, shows like Special, and they're rebooting a series called Queer as Folk, which is coming out this June, which they're featuring a lot of gay disabled actors and characters. And so I think we're starting to have the conversation and push the hopefully the needle a little bit in the community about being more accessible, both physically and emotionally. But we'll see. That for me has been my experience.
Have you seen Hi, Are You Single by Ryan Haddad?
I've seen a few clips, yes.
So Kylie and I had the privilege of going and seeing his production here at the Mammoth Theater, and meeting him. And it is a great production. And, like you, he's very engaging. And the play is a one-person show. And I think, people leave that seeing so many things. One, a great production. It's a disabled person as the actor who's very much revealing himself in a very personal way, enabling people, I think, both to laugh with him and get a better understanding of where he's coming from. And I think obviously he and you and many others, because of your ability to be so engaging and being in all these different settings where people are learning from you, I think that's all really quite important. What other projects are you currently working on that listeners should know about?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's Pride season is upon us. So one of the things that's really exciting is that I'm going to be the face of Crest's Pride campaign, the toothpaste. We've done a really fun billboard that we'll have 7 billboards here in Toronto, I believe 1 in Vancouver and 1 in Montreal. And then we created this really cool, sort of like a PSA for their website with my best friend Alex, who is cisgender male, heterosexual, married, and the video is about how not only he's an incredible ally to me as a queer disabled person, but his son, he's raising the next generation of allies, and making sure that he understands about the queer identity. And I'm so grateful that I have the ability to go and babysit him when they need help and all those sorts of things. So it's gonna be a really cute video, just showing what allyship looks like and raising the next generation of allies. So I'm really excited for that.
How did it come about? How did Crest get involved?
Yeah, it's the power of social media, Judy. It's bananas how that works. They just reached out. They'd seen my TikToks and they'd seen my Instagram. And because I talk about my identity, they were like, are you interested in being a part of this campaign this year for Pride? So
very, very exciting.
Yeah.
So, you talked about how it relatively recently, I think you were saying like 8 years or so, before you really started publicly speaking and identifying more as a disabled person.
Mhm.
What are some of your thoughts for not just younger people, but people of all ages around the issue of identification? And what thoughts and messages do you have to people about how they can explore accepting their disability as something which is not a tragedy?
Yeah, this is a good question. Also, I feel like a hard question, because I think so often there's so many outside factors that contribute to these sorts of things. It's like, how does your community view disabled folks? How does your smaller personal community, from your family to your friends, view your disability? And then oftentimes, at least for me, that's what sort of shaped my identity in the beginning, right? Was we were told, even though you don't have legs, like, you can do everything that anybody else can, and that's really important to focus on the positive and those sorts of things. And so it was never a discussion. It was never talked about. And it wasn't until I sort of leaned into my authenticity and started to lean into my disability that I found how powerful I could be. But that took a lot of time. It took a lot of discussion and self-exploration and therapy. And I'm 41. So but what I think is interesting now, Judy, what I hope is happening, and this isn't necessarily really an answer, because I feel like it's similar to like the gay community. I don't want to force anybody to be anything that they're not ready for. And so for me, it's just exploring what's most comfortable for you and being open to the idea of that there might be more, and there might be more that you can lean into. And then for things like yourself, Judy, and Crip Camp and your podcast, and when you look at shows like Special and so many of the other shows that are now starting to exist with folks with disabilities, we're starting to have that sort of positive spin on it now of it's actually really amazing to be disabled and to lean into that. So I guess what I hope is with more examples, people start to understand that it's okay, but it's such a process, and everyone comes into it in their own time. I feel like now young people, because of access to media, it's happening faster because there are examples now where, for myself, and I'm sure even like you, Judy, there just wasn't that. It didn't exist. So we had to be the examples for ourselves.
Yeah.
That's not really an answer.
No, it is an answer, because there isn't an answer. We started out with this discussion a little bit about representation in the media. I think what's very important about the programs that you and others are on, which is so very different than when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, is that, we are seeing ourselves, those of us with visible disabilities, in a way which is not apologetic. I find it exciting that we are now seeing many more disability-led organizations that are bringing forward the voices of disabled people in various aspects of media, and that you're a very important part of that. Our movement is an intergenerational movement. Although I think for people who are older and acquiring disabilities, it's still maybe in some ways more difficult than for younger people to jump in. Are you doing any work with the aging community?
It's really interesting that you brought that up. Just this past November, I did a speech for the UN, and now it's the organization is escaping me, but basically the UN is now focusing on the aging population and the inequity that exists. They hosted their conference here in Niagara, which is just an hour outside of Toronto, and that was the first time that I started to explore that, and it was really timely, because I have a grandmother who 5 years ago had a stroke, and she's been navigating the healthcare system in the United States through her daughters, my mom and her sisters, and without getting too much into it, the healthcare system isn't set up for her. Her stroke affected her reasoning. So in some regards, she can take care of herself, but in other regards, she can't. And there really isn't a place for her that exists that can offer the kind of care that she needs. And it's been a really difficult time for my family to figure out where does she go, and to see all the inequity and and from funding to not being properly trained and all of those things. And so for me, it's something that I'm starting to become aware of as I get older and as people in my life and community start to get older. So I don't know what that looks like yet for me, and how I can lend a hand, so to speak. But I'm definitely learning firsthand through my family what that looks like.
When you think about your grandmother and her healthcare in the US, and you think about your grandmother if she were living with you in Toronto, do you have any idea what the difference would be in the kinds of services she would be able to get and the cost of those services?
It's not something that I can totally speak to, because I don't really know what the system looks like here in Canada when it comes to aging. I have a friend whose family member works in one, and I know that there are, Canada has their issues too. But I think my guess is, based on my experience of accessing, social medicine, is the cost would be different. And I think as you and I know, that can be a huge barrier. And so I think probably my guess is here in Canada that would be different, but I can't say that definitively, because I'm not as familiar with the system here.
But as a user of the system yourself, and having been a user of the system in the US, what types of variations do you see? I mean, the reason I raise this is, you are unique, at least as a disabled person who grew up in the US and who's now living in Canada, and who quite frankly lived in Wyoming, which everyone knows is a more conservative, anti-government state.
Yes.
Do you see your quality of life in Canada from a healthcare perspective different from Wyoming? And what would you say the differences are?
Absolutely. In multiple facets of my life. So I would say the first is, having access to universal health care. It's so much easier in regards to financially, you know what I mean? I'll give an example, Judy, just if this helps. Last summer, I was attending like a drag show outside, and I ended up getting heat stroke. I was able to ride in an ambulance and get proper care at a hospital, and it cost me $45 to ride in the ambulance. That's all I paid. Everything else was taken care of. And so having that access, having to go to the doctor, often, and not having to pay for that. I mean, we obviously pay for it with our taxes, but that has been a huge difference, and it brings a bit of comfort in knowing that that's one less thing that I have to worry about. Now, no system is perfect, and it has its difficulties navigating as well. But for the most part, it provides a lot of comfort. And then on the flip side of that, because Canada can be quite liberal, as someone that identifies as gay, the rights that I have here versus the rights that I have in the United States look very different as well. And Canada has been far ahead when it comes to queer rights. We still have a lot of work to do here too, but just in general, the quality of life as someone that is disabled and gay is, I find, for me personally, is this is going to sound terrible. My parents are going to be so sad. It's much better than the United States,
Well, although, we started this program talking about you as an artist, I think this part makes me cry. This part is a very important fact that people in the US really don't know about the Canadian healthcare system. And the propaganda that was used during campaigns against the ACA, with advertisements from people supposedly representing Canada who are coming down to the US for healthcare services. I appreciate very much your sharing this information, which is not anecdotal, but quite personal. And, when I think about ambulance services, medical services, and when someone here, gets sick and goes to the hospital, even with insurance, having to worry about the bills that we're going to get, which is not the case in Canada or many other countries. Well, we are wrapping up our program today, and I hope that those of you listening will really become part of the next million people that Spencer's Tik Tok, which I called a few minutes ago, Tic Tac, but will engage with, and other programs that he's doing. And I guess another message is, please look at healthcare systems like in Canada and most other countries around the world, and learn about the importance of having quality healthcare. And Spencer, from me to you, please do not get another heat stroke.
No, lesson learned. And Judy, if I may, I just really want to take this opportunity for what you and so many of the folks did for our community that you've been doing your whole life. For me to be successful today, that's because of you and because of the work that you have been doing and continue to do. And I feel really privileged that I got to share this time with you and meet someone who has done so much incredible work for the world and for the United States, and has allowed me to have the life that I have because you chose to not accept what existed. And I just think it's really important that I say thank you and how much gratitude I have for you.
I wish I could say I bore you and that you were my son, but the reality is I didn't. I'll adopt you. I could, I'm old enough. But I really, I appreciate your comments. And at the end of the day, I think what our movement around the world is doing is really releasing the talent of people like yourself, and that you're releasing other talent. So as I end yet another show crying out of joy, thank you very much, and we'll stay in touch.
I would love that. Thanks, Judy.
History won't forget us or try to minimize our pain.